Thus saith the Lord, stand ye in the ways, and see, and ask for the old paths, where is the good way, and walk therein, and ye shall find rest for your soul. You are now listening to the Old Paths Podcast, hosted by Brother Reggie Paige.
Peace and blessings, everybody, and welcome back to the Old Path Podcast. And yes, OP is short for overpowered. And that is not because I am overpowered, but it is He, the Most High God, who is overpowered. Thank goodness for that. Thank you for joining me once again. I am your host, Brother Reggie. And today's topic is going to be a interesting topic, a very historical packed topic. But before I begin, let us actually start off with a Bible verse. Job chapter 8, verse 8 through 10 states this. For inquire, I pray thee, of the former age, and prepare thyself to the search of their fathers. For we are but of yesterday, and know nothing, because our days upon earth are a shadow. Shall not they teach thee, and tell thee, and utter words out of their heart? So I started with these verses because I want you all to understand how much I genuinely love history and how much I also love the Word of God first and foremost. And I stress this out because too often the history we are taught is usually overly simplified and propagandized and or viewed in rose-tinted glasses, which can mislead and deceive us away from the truth. As for myself, when I understand history, it points me right to God's word. How? It proves that history is complex. Men are sinners and not just, video games. I think sometimes we look at history like it's a video game sometimes. And again, men are sinners. Men are human beings, flesh and blood. Men are sinners, and if you don't have God, what happens? We perish. History with God's word as your foundation will help you discern properly the what, the how, the why, and other essential meanings to certain historical persons as well as certain historical events. This is also why whenever I present any videos on historical events or persons, it becomes a very long 30-plus minute or more video because it is impossible to learn even a portion or a person or a certain event in history in 5 minutes. Sadly, we live in a lazy culture, a TikTok culture, where we just want information in 5, maybe 10 minutes, or it has to be in a fun musical form or on TikTok, right? Hopefully, those who are my faithful listeners truly appreciate my long-suffering effort in gathering the truth, the research about certain events and or people. My hope is that with all the research and love I put into these videos, especially pertaining to history, it would inspire you all to study the truth and not just be okay with the okie doke we are taught in schools, TikTok, YouTube, etc., etc. Another thing I will add is that I hate that Christians have believed in lies and or are ignorant to the truth on purpose, specifically in history. I have seen Christians wrongly glorify ungodly men because they were taught wrongly and did not study to show thyself approved unto God. It is important to know true history and not fall for the lies because, in effect, when we know true history, it forms our mindset in a way which we either accept the truth or deny the truth. As the scripture says, a little leaven can leaven the whole lump. And if we are willing to deny the truth about historical events or figures outside the Bible, then are we not walking on that thin line of denying the biblical truths from history and wisdom? Case in point, probably a year or two ago, I did a video about Martin Luther King Jr. or Michael King II. Now, many people believe that Martin Luther King Jr. was this godly Christian man that was martyred for Christ's cause. They probably think that the civil rights movement was a Christian movement too. However, the truth tells us that this man, Michael King II, believed that Christ was just a man and not 100% God from his own essays that he wrote. He also believed that the Bible was a book of myths, not my words, his own words. But because many people only quote that one, played out quote from his "I Have a Dream" speech, I live to see a day where, my children, black and white, blah, blah, blah. I don't care. I genuinely don't care. But they quote that same speech over and over again. And they have a hard time accepting the truth that Martin Luther King Jr. was just a wolf in sheep's clothing. This has had a negative effect on society as a whole, regardless of statues being built for him and being named after him. However, that man is not the point of our topic today, nor is the civil rights movement. I want to show you all the part of history that is really propagandized a lot. I will also be touching on a figure that most people sadly glorify on this side of heaven. Let me tell you a story about a time in history where serious Christian persecutions occurred no less than 160 years ago. Also where the light of the Word of God was almost diminished right here on American soil. Though it may be controversial to say what I'm going to say, the truth is that the way many people view the American Civil War is incorrect. The way it is usually taught in schools is that the old honest Abraham Lincoln fought a moral crusade against the institution of slavery. Many people believe that the southern states were leading a rebellion that would have somehow ended up taking over the whole United States and would have forced slavery all over, even into the free states. But this is not the truth. It's far from it. Some folks call the American Civil War the War of Northern Aggression, and that is the proper name for it, at least one of them. For it was Abraham Lincoln who chose to go into Fort Sumter in Virginia and do some unconstitutional acts, such as suspend habeas corpus. What is habeas corpus? Habeas corpus is a writ, a court order, a fundamental constitutional right that protects against unlawful and indefinite imprisonment. So in simpler words, the government cannot throw someone in jail just because they want to. For example, if I wrote an article about how I dislike the president cannot simply throw me in jail because he thinks I'm mean. Habeas corpus, you can find this law in Article 1, Section 9 of your Constitution, reading, "The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended, unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it." Now, many folks may think, well, the South was leading a rebellion against the Union. However, how can one lead a rebellion if the South simply wanted to just form their own government and not take over the Union? This is one of many uncomfortable questions I will pose throughout this presentation. Another question is, if you are perfectly okay with the colonies, the American colonies seceding from the British Empire to form their own republic, then how is that any different from what the South wanted to do? What about this question, which will be the main point of this presentation for those who believe they are conserving the Constitution and think that Abraham Lincoln conserved the Constitution? Why did Abraham Lincoln violate the Constitution on a plethora of occasions, starting with the suspension of habeas corpus to start the bloodiest war on American soil? Furthermore, with the suspension of habeas corpus, Lincoln imprisoned whoever he viewed as traitors in his own eyes, which included journalists. One of the journalists that he imprisoned, by the way, was I believe, the grandson of the guy that, if I'm not mistaken, that wrote the Star Spangled Banner. Ironic, isn't it? But yeah, he jailed journalists who wrote against him and the cause of the Union. He imprisoned preachers. And sadly, even imprison innocent civilians. Today, I want to talk about how Lincoln allowed Christian persecution and terrorized civilians, innocent civilians across the American South. He sent out characters like Sherman, Sheridan, Butler, and many others to execute total war upon the defenseless. He even used human shields long before Saddam Hussein used hostages around his missiles and military sites. Lincoln used them, he allowed them on Morris Island in Charleston Harbor. But let us talk about a time where the Union Army desecrated churches as well. These are the things that we're going to be going over in this presentation, hopefully, if it doesn't get too long. But I want to ask y'all this, especially those who thought this war was justified for whatever reason you may think as Bible believers. Do you think the things that I will go over that were done justified? So what is terrorism? There is a Chinese proverb that states this: the goal of terrorism is to kill one and frighten 10,000. Terrorism is nothing new under the sun, especially as a war tactic. When we label someone as a terrorist, we usually connect that with someone being a criminal due to the fact that terrorists usually commit terror on their enemies, which includes the innocent. Terrorism is a crime, or more precisely, a criminal tactic, whether employed in wartime or peacetime. This is why many nations have rules that punish those who are criminal terrorists. Next, what are the Lieber Codes? The Lieber Codes was the military law that governed the wartime conduct of the Union Army by defining and describing command responsibilities for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and the military responsibilities of the Union soldiers fighting in the American Civil War against the Confederate States of America. This code was codified by Abraham Lincoln into federal law in 1863 as General Order 100. With this order being established, we are able to actually measure if the Union military committed any war crimes. The Lieber Code detailed out precisely and fixed prohibitions juxtaposed with interpretive commentary and specific warnings concerning the lawful conduct of warfare. For example, in Article 15 of the Lieber Code states this: men who take up arms against one another in public, war do not cease on this account to be immoral beings, responsible to one another and to God. And even though the Confederate States had their own military codes called the Articles of War, regulations of the Army of the Confederate States, James A. Sedum, the Confederate Secretary of War, had no problem pledging to the Lieber War Codes. The Lieber Codes consisted of 10 sections broken down into 157 articles. The first section is about martial law, military jurisdictions, military necessities, and retaliations. Section 2 talked about public and private property of the enemy. Section 3 talks about deserters, prisoners of war, hostages, spoils. Section 4, partisans, armed enemies not belonging to the hostile armies, scouts, armed prowlers, war rebels. Section 5, safe conduct, spies, war traitors, captured messengers. Section 6, exchange of prisoners, flag of truce, flag of protection. Section 7, the parole. Section 8, armistice and capitulation. Section 9, assassination. And Section 10, insurrection, civil war, and rebellion. Now, if you focus, for those who are watching, down at Section 2, you see that human civilians and private property are covered during time of war, in which they should not be harmed or violated. Now, Francis Lieber, who was the German law professor at Columbia College, where we get the Lieber and Lieber codes from, stressed throughout the codes the humane treatments for non-combatants due to his first-hand witnessing of the inoffensive brutalization while he fought in the Prussian army against Napoleon. Article 25 states this: in modern regular wars of the Europeans and their descendants in other portions of the globe, protection of the inoffensive citizens of the hostile country is the rule. Privation and disturbance of private relations are the exceptions. Now keep this in mind as we will focus more on this topic throughout this presentation. And continue to learn as well as bear with me going over the Libra codes, for it is very important to understand and answer some of these uncomfortable questions and form our own questions to some of the things we thought were truth. And again, this is something that I guarantee that most of us was not even taught about in your schools. So, come on. What is military necessities? According to the Libra codes, it talks of though these citizens were viewed as enemies, Article 22 made it very clear that all enemy civilians were to be protected in their persons and property. When we look in Article 15, it addresses in its concepts of military necessities vis-a-vis civilians, non-combatants, where it was essential for the opposing military to impress needed supplies from them, but only if it is necessary, as read in Article 15, and I quote, for the subsistence and safety of the army. Article 38 adds, private property, unless forfeited by crimes or by offenses of the owner, can be seized only by the way of military necessities, and the commanding officers will cause receipts to be given, which may serve the spoilter owner to obtain indemnity. So, in other words, federal troops are prohibited by the General Order 100 to engage in any violent, harassing act towards non-combatant civilians, period. And if they do not take, and if they do take from them, they must repay. If these codes were violated, Article 47 states this: crimes punishable by all penal codes, such as arson, murder, maiming, assault, highway robbery, theft, burglary, fraud, forgery, and rape, if committed by an American soldier in a hostile country against its inhabitants, are not only punishable as at home, but in all cases in which death is not inflicted, the severer punishment shall be preferred. In turn, any act of violence towards civilians and their private property is completely prohibited. And Article 37 reinforces the protection of civilians of the opposing side who are non-combatants, to the point that in Article 44, this authorizes superiors to shoot offenders, and I quote, on the spot, for merciless violence on the civilians. And it states this specifically: all wanton violence committed against persons in the invaded country, all destructions of property not commanded by the authorized officer, all robbery, all pillage, or sacking, even after taking a place by main force, all rape, wounding, maiming, or killing of such inhabitants are prohibited under the penalty of death or such other severe punishments as may seem adequate for the gravity of the offense. A soldier, officer, or private in the act of committing such violence and disobeying a superior ordering him to abstain from it may be lawfully killed on the spot by such superior. So the Libra Code also protected certain public property. Yes, government buildings may be destroyed, but places such as hospitals, churches, libraries, universities, banks were excluded from warfare. As stated in Article 34 states this: as a general rule, the property belonging to churches, to hospitals, or other establishments of an exclusively charitable character, to establishments of education or foundations for the promotion of knowledge, whether public schools, universities, museums of fine arts, or of scientific character, such property is not to be considered public property, but it may be taxed or used when the public service may require it. Then we read Article 27 through 28. We read about the terms of retaliation. Now, retaliation during the time of the Civil War was not like some game-banging nature. The opposing side that wants to seek revenge was to provide a written or verbal warning to the wrongdoing. And only if the wrongdoer refused to comply with the warning to cease and desist the illegal conduct, then the side seeking revenge could initiate a response to that illegal act. But this is to be used only as a last resort. For Francis Lieber warned that retaliation was a tool that, if not used sparingly, could rapidly lead to, and as I quote him, the internecine wars of savages. As stated in Article 27, the law of war can no more wholly dispense with retaliation or reprisals than can the law of nations, of which it is a branch. Yet civilized nations acknowledge retaliation as the sternest feature of war. A reckless enemy often leaves to his opponent no other means of securing himself against the repetition of barbarous outrage. So, again, what happens is you're provoking them to barbarous wrath, pretty much. I mean, it's one thing if you punch me in the face, but if you decide to, go past me and punch my wife and my kids and my loved ones, well, you're kind of pushing me to, a different limit, a different zone of, I just want to punch you back in the face, to, I'm probably going to find your wife, your kids. Now, I'm not saying that's what I'll do personally, but do you see that that vicious cycle that ensues when we do heinous acts and then seek revenge heinously? Now, with all of these military codes that were written to protect the innocent and private property, no matter south or north, was Lincoln and his general willing to operate the war outside of the Lieber Codes and General Order 100? In a letter from Abraham Lincoln written to James C. Conkling, his longtime friend, and who was also a part of the Illinois House of Representatives, Lincoln quotes this: has there been any questions that by the law of war, property, both enemies and friends, may be taken when needed? And is it not needed whenever taking it helps us or hurts the enemy? Armies, the world over, destroys enemies' properties when they cannot use it, and even destroy their own to keep it from the enemy. Civilized belligerents do all in their power to help themselves or hurt the enemy, except a few things regarded as barbarous or cruel. Among the exceptions are the massacre of vanquished foes and non-combatants, male and female. So here, in a subtle way, Lincoln tells Conkling that he is somewhat willing to kind of look the other way. Now, during the first 2 years of the Civil War, such morally horrific acts were not as common. They were common, but not as common. Those acts actually began to rise with the Union Army breaking the laws of war by attacking non-combatants, of which I will get into. Just bear with me as I set some things up. Now, of course, one can make the assumption of many of the acts not being reported, therefore Lincoln didn't know. However, there is plenty of evidence that Lincoln knew what was going on, as well as the people in his camp or cabinet who would have most likely told him the going-ons of the war betwixt the states. On May 1863, Lieber, the man we get the name the Lieber Codes from, himself wrote to General Henry Halleck, the General-in-Chief of the Army, this: I know by letters from the West and the South, written by men on our side, of course, that the wanton destruction of property by our men is alarming. It does incalculable injury. It demoralizes our troops, it annihilates wealth irrevocably, and make a return to a state of peaceful minds more and more difficult. Your order, though impressive and even sharp, might be written with references to the code and pointing out the disastrous consequence of reckless devastation. See, Francis Lieber knew if the war became a war of savagery, and when the Confederates lost and got forced back into the Union, that root of bitterness would have been springing forth from the southern soil because of the reckless and wanton acts against the innocent people. Oh, and by the way, that is what ended up happening. I will add that the northern civilians did not, in comparison to the southern civilians, have to worry as much about the tangible effects of the war between the states due to the fact that most of the battles were fought in the South. And let me add this also. It's scary when I meet people, especially Christians, who are so quick to support our troops to go to war in other countries that benefit us in no ways. I always think, do they truly understand the terror of war? My goddaughter and I was having a conversation the other day, and she was telling me how when America is at war, the civilians in America usually are sitting at the table drinking tea and eating steak, while the civilians of the other country we are fighting against are living in complete fear. What if the roles were reversed? Then will we be quick to think war is a good business, good for a good nation, good for a civilized nation? As I digress. The fact that Lieber warned General Halleck, one of the top-ranking officers of the Union Army, is something not to ignore. General Halleck was to report such matters to his boss, Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, as well as President Old Honest Abraham Lincoln. Furthermore, there were a buku of reports of the lawlessness of the Union Army on the Southern non-combatants and their property. William O. Stoddard, Lincoln's personal secretary, confirms that Lincoln, General Halleck, and Stanton were in constant and close communication with each other on all matters pertaining to the war, including war crimes. And I quote, General Halleck is in constant communication and consultation with the President and Secretary of War. The three work together in perfect harmony, end quote. So there is little doubt that Lincoln would have known the going-ons of the war. As the war was dragging on, the abuses were so rampant that it was impossible not to know of these atrocities of the breaking of the laws of war against civilians and private property. And sadly and horrifically, we are going to tread into some stormy waters where Lincoln was complacent and actually approving the scorched earth tactics requested by certain Union generals on these Southern civilians. At the beginning of 1864, it was actually becoming evident that the Confederates were going to lose the war. However, they weren't hopeless and had too much fight and honor within their culture to quit cold turkey for the reason that they were genuinely fighting for, which was their independence, which actually makes me pose this question. Will we still view George Washington as a hero if the colonies would have lost the war for American independence? Just a food for thought. But because of the bleakness of the war on the Confederate States, they had to switch from being on the offensive to holding its own battlefield on Southern soil in hopes that they can hold the fort until hopefully the November elections. Now, during this time, and something that is most not really known, the Republicans and Lincolns might have been voted out of office due to the weariness of the war and his constant declarations of drafting people into the army, which caused the bloodiest spur hatred on American soil, period. In the North, harsh suppression of dissent resulting in the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus in several states, imprisonment, and even exile of opposition figures, and other constitutional infringements along with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which many outside of the New England rebelled against despite popular indoctrinated beliefs today. Again, many people think this war was fought for slavery. But if the war was fought for slavery, why did this happen? When the Federal Draft Act of March 1863 was passed, it sparked massive riots in New York City, and the largest number of lynchings of so-called blacks in history to date happened. Oh, and that was in New York, by the way, not the South, in New York. Many who fought for the Union did not fight other so-called white men to free the so-called black lives. Again, do you start when you just simply just look at the truth, look at some of the evidence, you'll start to see that maybe this moral crusade sounds more political, sounds very much like a political crusade than a moral crusade. But With all of this stewing up, Lincoln had to do something to gain the support, or else he would have most likely been voted out of office in November 1864. With the South's spirit of resistance, despite things not going too well, especially in the Western theater of the war, the Union had to come up with a new general strategy to break that spirit. General Ulysses S. Grant, after taking Vicksburg and being victorious at Missionary Ridge, Grant became thrusted to the top of the Union's military command, which means Lincoln looked hard to General Grant to topple the Confederacy. In late 1863, Grant formed a simple and methodical grand plan, which was not going to be a swift knockout like how many other past generals thought the war was going to be. Again, many of the generals thought this war was going to be quick, and they were surprised that the war lasted, that long. The strategy was going to be a long strangle game that took the North's far superior muscle, and he was going to gather, I believe, 20 at this time. I can't remember, but about 21 Army Corps at that time together and conduct a full-out synchronized attack of slow, overwhelming force. Now, of course, the risk of doing that is that the casualties on the Union side, not the Confederates, but the Union side, as they're attacking, it will be brutal. However, this still didn't seem to faze Grant, Lincoln, and all of them because they knew these soldiers could be replaced easily. And why was that? It was due to the influx of immigrants, specifically the German immigrants, coming off the boats in New York by the tens of thousands. Hence, many of the Union soldiers were fresh immigrant draftees, FYI. Again, this is stuff that if you just do a little digging, you'll start to see a different story than the one that we're pushed in schools and pushed to believe, right? Again, this was something the South did not have. They didn't have immigrants, that influx of immigration. Therefore, when the Southern men died, they didn't have enough men to be replaced. Here is where we start to begin the story of the scorched earth suffering. The two main federal armies in the Eastern Theater that Grant personally oversaw were General George Meade, who led the Army of the Potomac, and General Ben Beast Butler, who led the Army of the James. Grant also authorized General Franz Sigel to advance a troop into the valley to prevent reinforcements or replenishments to come to Lee's embattled troops. Also, General Sigel was authorized to employ open terror tactics on Southern farmers, which includes burning down crops of any other farms, burning down farms all throughout the Shenandoah Valley. By the way, all of this is not allowed to happen unless it is approved by Lincoln. Lincoln approved on Grant's strategy, and he also looked the other way on the scorched earth total war strategy too. And why? Well, when you think about it, think about the strategy. It's quite simple. If the South had this spirit to keep fighting for their independence, well, the wide-scale terrorism on the innocent would pretty much mortify the Southerners to cause families, soldiers, and the government to stop resisting the Union invasion and surrender. Now, without further ado, let us look at some specific examples of the atrocities which was in breaking of the war codes, right? The Lieber codes. So the first example will be called Total War in the Shenandoah Valley. And this is from the book called Cultures and Conflict by Charles A. Jennings. This is a good book that has plenty of first-hand accounts of the atrocities that occurred during the time of the war between the states. So it states this: the original intent of many fanatical abolitionists, radical Republicans, the Lincoln administrations, the political, journalistic, and religious establishments of the North in their psychological and military assault upon the South was to so permanently change the totality of the Southern culture, politics, and even religion so that it will never be the same again. This rabid hatred of the South was transferred to and instilled in many Union Army generals and troops, which they expressed in their military plans, which they called, and I quote, total war. Union General Philip H. Sheridan expressed his contempt and seething hatred for the people of Virginia when he said that it was his intention to wreak such devastation in the Shenandoah Valley that, and I quote, a crow flying over will have to carry his own rations. Seemingly, he was a man who had no sense of humane regard for his fellow men. The true nature of this warmonger and his crimes are reported in the Southern Historical Society Papers, Volume 29, 1901. This officer is reputed to have said that the true principles for conducting war are, and I quote, first, deal as hard blows to the enemy's soldiers as possible, and then cause so much suffering to the inhabitants of the country that they will long for peace and press their government to make it. Nothing should be left to the people but eyes to lament the war. In Sheridan's letter to Grant, dated Woodstock, October 7, 1864, he says this: in moving back to this point, the whole country, from the Blue Ridge to the North Mountain, has been made untenable for the rebel army. I have destroyed over 2,000 barns filled with wheat and hay and farming implements, over 70 mills filled with flour and wheat, have driven in front of the army over 4,000 heads of stock, and have killed and issued to the troops not less than 3,000 sheep. This destruction embraces the Luray Valley and the Little Fort Valley, as well as the main valley. A large number of horses have been obtained, a proper estimate of which I cannot now make. Lieutenant John R. Meigs, my engineer officer, was murdered beyond Harrisonburg near Dayton. For this atrocious act, all the houses within an area of 5 miles were burned. It is not generally known. We believe that this policy of devastation on the part of Sheridan was directly inspired and ordered by General Grant, who, in his memoirs, writes with great satisfaction and levity of the outrages committed by Sherman before referred to, and which he, of course, understood would be committed from the terms of Sherman's telegram to him, and which he, at the last, acquiesced in. And I quote, on the 5th of August, 1864, he, talking about Grant, wrote to General David Hunter, who preceded Sheridan in commanding of the valley, as follows. In pushing up the Shenandoah Valley, where it is expected you will have to go first or last, it is desirable that nothing should be left to invite the enemy to return. Take all provisions, forage, and stock wanted for the use of your command, such as cannot be consumed, destroy. On another occasion, Grant wrote to Sheridan and said, and I quote, if the war is to last another year, we want the Shenandoah Valley to remain a barren waste. And you can find this from the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, 1861 through 1865, A War Story by Sanford C. Kellogg, 1903. This was nothing more than wanton destruction and vandalism under the guise of war. It was utter devastation and malicious thievery committed by ruthless men under orders from their high command as a way for them to vent their vile feelings of hate and contempt upon helpless civilians. Besides committing outright thievery from personal residences, depleting the inventories of stores, and abusing any Southerner at will, their willful disregard for sacred houses of worship and cemeteries was appalling, even to some of their own soldiers. Recorded in William Wallace's Civil War letters, the Virginia campaign, William Wallace, no relation to the Williams Wallace of Scotland. He was a 31-year-old William Wallace of Banks Division, Wisconsin regiment. And he states this in his memoirs. After all was settled, the wagons were sent to Bolivar for our knapsacks, and in the meantime, we were quartered in the several churches through the town. It was blowing a perfect gale, cold and piercing. No person would open the church we were sent to. The major ordered 2 men to break open the door if the old preacher would not open it. In a few minutes, he gave up the key, and we were in the Episcopal church. At 4 in the evening, the wagons got back after night, And then we had to go out in the dark and search for our knapsacks, which was not an easy matter to find, but we got them. Made our beds in the pews of the church. It was a curious sight to see so many warlike men in it, the house of the living God where his word has often been preached. I felt myself that I was committing a sacrilege, but it could not be avoided. The existence of the time required it, for we could not lay out. The aisles and pews were well carpeted, but they were not long that collar with the mud and tobacco spit. At this moment, it is ridiculous to look at, but the boys say it is owned by rebels and it is no harm. They hardly ever stop playing the organ while others is playing cards and playing the fiddle and dancing, swearing all around. This war will ruin many a soul. It is handing it over to Satan each day. Some of the companies has their tents in the cemeteries with the head of the living against the headstones of the dead. The tombstone serves for tables to eat off, and at the same time blaspheming the name of the Redeemer, not thinking how soon they may be in the land of forgetfulness. Typical of the Union Army under the command of Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley were widespread reports of pillage and looting, which Sheridan referred to as foraging. In Sheridan's The Life and Wars of General Phil Sheridan by Ray Morris, he recounts the following incidents, and I quote, "But the crowning blow came when Wilson showed Sheridan a dispatch from Meade demanding that Wilson defend himself from sensational charges made by the Richmond newspaper that Union cavalry had broken into churches and homes during the raid, and that Wilson himself, a highway, a winebibber, and a modern serendipitous, had encouraged such looting." Sheridan said of Meade, "Darn him. Give him hell." Wilson then proceeded to defend his men, although he was forced to concede that, and I quote, "there exists in our cavalry service an organized band of thieves who are under no restraint whatever, and who have been skillful enough so far to elude every attempt to arrest." This evil and blatant disregard for sacred houses of worship was not a late development in the war as a result of revenge from the weary and war-hardened soldiers. As early as June 1861, Confederate Lieutenant Daniel H. Hill and his men had discovered where the enemy had defaced Bethel Church near Jamestown, Virginia. The evacuating Yankee troops had scrawled on the church walls, stating, "Death to the traitors, and down with the rebels." And hey, sadly, that's just the low-down gospel truth. And I'm sorry that we got to end it on some low-down things. But the next episode, we're going to get deeper and more into some of the atrocities against churches, against civilians, innocent civilians. But even worse, how Abraham Lincoln actually went to war against the souls, the spiritual state of the American South by making the Bible a contraband of war. And I guarantee most of you ain't never heard this story, but tune in next episode to hear. If you enjoyed this episode so far, please do like, comment, and subscribe. And if you disagree or whatsoever, just look at the bibliography I'm going to give y'all, okay? But please, comment, subscribe, and share the knowledge with the folks and kinfolks. And remember this, as inconvenient the truth may be at times, the truth shall make you free. May the God of peace of all knowledge have mercy and grace upon you all. Peace.